John here from Great Lakes Country with the third and probably final installment of what I'm calling my mini jalapeno canning series. First, we did classic pickled jalapeno rings, the kind that you'd buy in a jar at the store. Next, we did not pickled jalapenos, pressure canned for use in basically anything that calls for not pickled jalapeno. And in this video, we're doing something really special, as I'm sure you already know, and that's making the most beautiful hot jalapeno jelly. We're gonna whip up this batch of jalapeno jelly, we're gonna can it all up, and I'm gonna have some beautiful jalapeno jelly to eat whenever I want. If you're a fan of spicy food and jalapenos, but you've never had jalapeno jelly, you're definitely missing out. There's a lot of things you can do with it. It's very common to take a little slice of crusty bread that's nice and toasted, spread some cream cheese on it, then spread on some of that jalapeno jelly. Very tasty appetizer, especially for people who like spicy food. My personal favorite way to use this jalapeno jelly is actually as a glaze for meat. I love using it on grilled chicken. When that chicken's about, let's say 65% done, slather some of this jelly on it. It just sort of cooks on and caramelizes a little bit. Makes for some great flavor on some otherwise maybe boring grilled chicken. Anyway, we got a few things to do here, so let's jump right in and start looking at the jalapenos we're gonna be using today. Here we've got about 24 ounces of fresh jalapeno, which works out to be about 22 medium-sized jalapenos. And we just need to get these things prepped, and it's pretty simple. First, I'll cut off the stem end, then I'm gonna slice the whole thing long ways, and I wanna remove the majority of the seeds and pithy stuff in the middle here. Usually I can just sort of scoop that out with my thumb, and that's about it. For our jalapeno jelly, we don't really want any seeds in it if we can avoid it, or any of this pithy stuff. It's just not gonna be very good. And once we got our jalapenos all halved and seeded, now we just need to kind of roughly chop them up into a few smaller pieces. Don't have to get too particular here, just kind of break these things down into some smaller chunks so they can go through the food processor a little easier. Now we need to get these cut up jalapenos all blended up. So into the food processor they go, along with 1 cup of apple cider vinegar. Now we just process on high until everything is broken down into basically a complete puree. Next, I'm going to carefully pour all of that puree jalapeno into a stock pot. And it looks pretty foamy right now, but as we go on with the next steps, most of this will settle quite a bit. And it may be hard to tell on camera, but there are some very teeny tiny little flecks in there so that it didn't really get ground up. It's basically bits of the jalapeno skin. It's really hardly noticeable, but if there are some of those little bitty flecks in our final jelly product, I don't mind that at all, and I actually rather kind of like the way they look in there. But anyway, now we need to get this pot over a burner and start actually turning this stuff into our jelly. Now into this pot, we're gonna add a couple more ingredients. First, another 3 cups of apple cider vinegar and an almost ridiculous 12 cups of white sugar. I'll mention that I am making a double batch today, and you can certainly have every part of this, but in either case, there's no getting around the fact that this jelly does call for an absolute ton of sugar. Now I'll get my flame turned on to pretty high, and we're gonna let that start heating up as we get everything stirred in. Now what we wanna do is get all of this brought up to a boil. And I know it looks pretty foamy, but I'm not worried about that right now. A lot of that will subside, and if there's any foam still on there at the end, we'll just skim it off. But as this all heats up, that sugar will dissolve in, everything will thin out a little bit, and I guess we'll jump ahead a couple minutes to when this thing has come up to a boil. All right, we finally come up to a boil, and I'll mention that I did end up transferring all of this stuff into a much taller stock pot. because, as is a terrible habit of mine, I used too small of a pot and I had a horrible boil over, making a huge mess, which I'm super excited about cleaning up. And while I get this little burner all cleaned up, I decided to move the operation outdoors anyway. We'll use the Camp Chef stove out there for the rest of this, and it's gonna work out just fine. Anyway, now that I've got this mixture at a boil, I just need to let it continue boiling for 10 minutes. And I'm gonna be stirring it pretty frequently during that 10 minutes. So we'll jump ahead another little bit when it's time to do the next thing. Okay, we've been boiling for 10 minutes and now it's time to add our pectin, because almost all jelly requires pectin. And for this recipe, we're using liquid pectin. I'm using this brand right here, but really you can use any brand of liquid pectin. And I need 12 ounces of this stuff, which is basically 2 entire boxes. There's 2 packets per box, each one's 3 ounces. I need 12 ounces, so that's 4 of them. I'll get them all in there, and then let this whole thing come back up to a full rolling boil, stirring again pretty much constantly. Once I'm at a completely full rolling boil that I can't stir down with the spoon, I'm gonna let that go for 1 full minute. Again, stirring constantly. After that minute, I'm taking the pot off the heat and we're just about ready to start canning. Now we're finally ready to start canning up this jalapeno jelly. So I'll get my little half-pint jars lined up on the cutting board, which I have had simmering in hot water in the water bath canner for the last little while to make sure they're good and sanitized. And let's see if we can take a look at that jelly mixture. And you can see there's not really any more foam on top, so we don't really need to worry about skimming anything. So we're just gonna get to filling up these jars. So using my little canning funnel and a ladle, I'll just start loading it in. And what I'm looking for is to fill these things almost to the top, but I want to leave 1/4 of an inch of headspace at the top. So I'll just get it pretty close, because then we're going to come back around and measure it anyway. And just as I'd hoped, this batch got me basically exactly 10 half-pint jars of my jelly, with just a little bit left in the pot. So now I'm gonna come through with my headspace measuring tool, and basically I wanna check to see if the 1/4 inch notch lines up with the level that I've poured into each jar. And I can already tell that I'm gonna have to come in and add a little bit more to a couple of these, make sure I've only got a 1/4 inch of headspace, which really isn't very much. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So now we'll debubble. And that just means I'll use the other end of this headspace measuring tool and just give each jar a gentle stir. Basically, just scrape down the inner walls of the jar, give it a little stir, make sure there's no big air bubbles trapped down in there. I'm realizing that the color of this jelly looks super dark on this camera monitor, but in real life, it's really a perfectly pleasant, sort of medium green color, which is exactly what I would expect out of something made from jalapeno. Next, I need to wipe the rim of each jar, and there's no question that I've made a pretty big mess of them, ladling in that sticky, sort of thick liquid. And of course, the reason we have to do this is because we can't have any jalapeno jelly sitting on top of that rim obstructing the rubber gasket of the lid. Because if there's anything in the way, it's not going to form a good seal and we will not have a successful canning. So I'll just very thoroughly go over each one, making sure there's absolutely nothing left on the top rim of each jar before I move on. And I'm just using some damp paper towel to do this. Some people dip a paper towel in some vinegar. I think the water usually works pretty good. And these jars are incredibly hot because of what's in them. So I'm using my jar lifter grabber tool to hold them in place while I do this, because I can't really touch these things at this point. Okay, and now it's time to put on our lids, and I've had these lids sitting here in some simmering water for a few minutes. And I always mention that manufacturers used to say that you had to boil the lids, but in more recent times they actually recommend against doing so, saying that boiling them could damage the gasket. But they say that simmering the lids is still fine, so that's what I do. And next up, you guessed it, the metal rings. We'll add the metal rings to each jar, tightening them down until they're just snug, but we're not trying to crank these things down with all our might. Just get them good and snug, and that's all you need. Now let's move outside and get these jars into the canner. So here I've got my hot water bath canner filled up with enough water to cover all of the jars by at least 1 inch. But before I plunge those jars into that water, I like to take one extra step. Using my little infrared thermometer, I'll first take a temperature reading of the hot water bath canner water. And it looks like I'm at about 158 degrees. Then I'll take a temperature reading of the outside of one of my jars, and it looks like I'm at about 145 degrees. And the reason I check those temperatures is because I don't want to stick these jars into that water if there's a big difference in temperature. If the canner water is much hotter than the jars, or the jars are much hotter than the canner water, well, I'm opening myself up to the risk of breaking some glass. So I like to make sure that those temperatures are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 degrees apart or less, and it looks like I'm just about in the zone that I'm comfortable with. And I'll say that since I've been doing this little extra step, I've never once had a jar break because of too hot or too cold water in the canner. Anyway, I'll carefully lower each jar in with my jar lifter tool, doing my best to make sure the jars aren't touching one another or the outside walls of the canner. It's pretty full with 10 of these jars in there, but I do know that they'll fit. Then I'm cranking the heat on this stove up to high, and I need to let this water come up to a full boil. Only once it's at a full boil has the processing time begun. And the processing time for this recipe in these half-pint jars is 10 minutes. So jumping ahead, my water's at a full boil, so on goes the lid. I'll set my timer for 10 minutes, and we'll come back then. Okay, processing is over. The heat is off, and I've got the lid removed. I'll just let these jars sit here for another couple minutes to let them just start to come down in temperature a little bit, and then I'll carefully remove each one, get them moved back into the house, set them all out on a towel on the board. Now I just need to leave them alone until they're fully cooled down to room temperature. And over the next little while, I'll expect to hear each lid pop, which is the center of the lid being pulled downward, thereby signaling a successful canning. As always, if any of these lids don't seal, well, I have to consider that particular jar not shelf stable, and I could put a new lid on and process again, but generally I would just throw that particular jar in the fridge and make sure to use it first. Failed seals don't happen often, but they do happen sometimes, and they happen to everyone. As for all of these jars, well, I expect that all of them will seal properly, and now I'll have tons of delicious jalapeno jelly to put up on the shelf and enjoy anytime I want. And one last note, if I find that I've got any sticky jelly residue still on the outside of these jars from when I ladled that stuff into the jars, well, once these jars are totally cooled down to room temperature, I can absolutely remove the metal ring, rinse the jars all off in the sink, make sure all of that sticky residue is off there, and set them on the counter, let them dry, and they'll be perfectly squeaky clean. So there it is, some beautiful jalapeno jelly, all canned up, ready to put in the pantry and enjoy whenever I want throughout the year. And if you're a big jalapeno fan and you haven't already seen the previous 2 jalapeno canning videos, be sure to check those out. And in the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including lots of future canning and food preservation videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.